here in 2024. And I think many of us might have the topic of climate anxiety, maybe slightly elevated even than it was maybe 2 weeks ago. Um, and so I think this conversation is probably coming at the exact time that it needs to. So again, today's event will explore climate anxiety, which can be defined as distress about climate change and its impacts on the landscape and human existence. That can manifest as intrusive thoughts or feelings of distress about future disasters or long-term future of human existence in the world, including one's own descendants. Climate anxiety is certainly a growing trend, particularly amongst younger generations, and is yet another example of how the climate crisis has a profound, far-reaching effects that matter to millions. This phenomenon has been explored through a number of perspectives, and we are delighted to have one of the members of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance Steering Committee to guide us through this important conversation. I'd like to thank Stinson for their sponsorship of this series. It's really helped us put this on, and I'd like to put in a quick plug for our last program in the series, which is Solutions and the Path Forward, which will be taking place on December 4th at the Evergy campus. That's going to be a lunchtime program. It's going to feature Rachel Stroher, who's the president of the Land Institute. It's going to feature Evergy's Vice President of Development, Jason Humphrey, Max Canninger, who's the founder and CEO of Canby Markets here in Kansas City, as well as Andy Savastino, who's the Chief Environmental Officer for the city of Kansas City. So now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and first introduce our moderator for today's program before introducing our speaker. So Sam McCloskey works for the Missouri Department of Conservation as the Nature Center Manager at the Burr Oak Woods Conservation Nature Center in Blue Springs, Missouri. Growing up in the St. Louis area, you could find Sam McCloskey somewhere in the outdoors, spending time in his backyard, at his family farm, canoeing the Current River, or hiking the Irish wilderness. This passion continued and is translated into a career focused on organization, relevancy, stewardship of public lands, and engagement of the broader public in hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation. For over 3 years, Sam has proudly served as the manager of the Burr Oak Woods Nature Center for the Missouri Department of Conservation, during which he has been fortunate to be involved with One Health, resource management, education, outreach, and community engagement. Sam, thank you so much for being here today and help us guiding through this conversation. And I'd also like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Hawsey, who's the Medical Director of Behavioral Health at Carson Tahoe Regional Medical Center and an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Nevada in Reno. In her other time, she works on raising awareness of climate mental health impacts through writing, presentations, and advocacy with the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. Current projects include papers on working with climate anxiety and psychotherapy and how suicide may be associated with climate change, and continued work on her film about preparing children for their climate future, Frogs in a Pot, with Jessica Haller and John Felix. Thank you so much for being here today, for taking us through this capacious topic. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, everyone. So please, as you're moving through the program, think of things that you have particular interest in, and we'll ask them at the end. So without further ado, please take it away.
Okay, Sam, do you want to say anything before we get started, or?
Just hello, and thank you for the opportunity to be involved in this. I'll do my best to capture all the questions that we have time for at the end. So yeah, feel free to think of those questions. But
Okay. All
nice
right. So hello, everybody. I can't see very many of your actual live faces, but I'm sorry that we're a little bit confused about the time here. So I'm sitting in an office in Bronxville, New York. They said that it might be a good idea just to have some visuals, so I've thrown together a few slides that we can use. But we also made the deal that this would be a fairly casual presentation because I'm on vacation, kind of traveling a lot, so I haven't over prepared in any way, I hope. So I think just listening to the introduction, what I would say is that, climate anxiety actually really wasn't a thing when I started doing this work about 2011. And my friend said, like, what should I be doing with my kids to help them be prepared for climate change, both emotionally and practically? And so we've sort of pulled this all together in the last 13 years in terms of having any mental health opinions about it. It's really come from people and from the media that awareness about the amount of distress got started. And as a result of which, there's not a ton of like data or like, vetted techniques or anything like that. So everything I'm going to be saying are the thoughts of a bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists over the last decade, basically. And we did just pull what is known in terms of academic stuff into a book, which is called Climate Change and Youth Mental Health. And I'm one of the editors on that. And if you want to get like a baseline, like a state of the field thing, that's a good book, which is available on Cambridge University Press. But in terms of climate anxiety, I'll share a few slides. And let's see, what am I doing here? And we can talk it then after about 20 minutes, depending on how far I get. So go away there. Where are you? There we go. There have been two big studies about climate anxiety in young people. The first one was done a few years ago led by Hickman, and was of children internationally, and that found these rates that you see here: 60% of the kids are very to extremely worried, and 85% of them moderately worried. And that study was just repeated in the States, looking at just American youth. And came out literally a month before the election, and notably has almost exactly the same results. And so we know that like a very large number of young people are very concerned about climate change. When you ask adults, between 70 and 90% of them will say that they are at least moderately to somewhat concerned about climate change. So there's a tremendous amount of stress out there. And if you think about it, like, it's unusual that if you asked your friends, would 80% of them say that they had the same anxiety about something? That's actually not all that common. What we don't really know is how that compares to other anxiety disorders like panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. Are these kids who are more or less anxious than general children? And so there have been people trying to put together climate anxiety scales, and figure out what the rates of sort of clinical distress are in this population. And balanced against that has been the idea that we really don't want to pathologize this at all, because it's a normal anxiety to a real problem. And so there's sort of this balance between, really, we do want to understand if these kids are having significant clinical symptoms, but we also don't want to, give an excuse to say, oh, well, they're all just like, they have psychiatric disorders and that's their problem. What we do know about it is mostly these kids tend to be actually a little bit more psychologically healthy than other people. They tend to be imaginative, creative, connected young people. They tend to be more women other than others. And they tend to be sort of have characteristics of openness and problem-based coping that allow them to be fairly successful in life. Or they can be people that are, in some ways already suffering the consequences of climate change or been impacted by weather disasters and stuff like that. So that's sort of the academics of it. The way that we see it in the office are people coming in after a major hurricane, or some other sort of major disaster event, people coming in with climate grief after working in biology or some other field like that, people coming in with a lot of anger towards their elders. This can be transferred onto a therapist. So as a therapist, you're kind of trying to see how you fit into this person's view of, and a person who's in a leadership position could have done something about this. People who are victims of climate injustice have had it with that. There's been some cases of teenagers really acting out self-destructively, like the world's going to end. Why not like just drug, sex, and rock and roll? Like, I don't care about my future at all. Kind of suicidal. And then you see it in relationships where there's either a childbearing issue or an issue in the couple because there's difference in how distressed they are. As a therapist, you're kind of looking for whether somebody's living consonant with the concern that they're expressing, right? So if they're in a state of disavowal, that's something that can be a focus of therapeutic concern. Disavowal means that you're aware of something, but it's the sort of idea that, you are sitting at a dinner party in New York City, complaining about climate change, and you say, and the airplane ride was so bumpy, but you're still living in a way that like goes on airplanes rides often enough to create significant global warming. So that kind of disavowed lifestyle. And then they're on the opposite extreme, people who are sort of overburdened by shame and guilt that their own personal lifestyle is that can be a source of distress. Then there are people that are suffering from existential anxiety, and then a whole range of other feeling states. Pretty much, if there is an emotion, you can have it about climate change. Fear, loss, guilt, anger. On the opposite end, lack of concern, and really a heartbroken state of despair are the sort of more common emotions, and often states of overwhelm and states of dissociation, which is a response to overwhelm, that you just disconnect from what you're experiencing. When you think about where this is coming from, there are many, many, many sources. There are the actual real threats. Very normal to be anxious about something that's seriously dangerous to 2/3 of the world's population. Then there's empathy for others who are suffering because of it. The uncertainty of the future can be a big source of distress for people, and worries about what will be for their children and grandchildren, and also what they're losing narcissistically in terms of their legacies. And by narcissistically, I don't mean like the personality disorder. I just mean they're sort of narcissistically losing a great deal of what they've invested in. Burnout, demoralization, particularly in first responders, is something that we see. Grief, like we talked about before. And then this difficulty with identity, which can show up in a bunch of forms, like you're sort of living in two places at once. You want to be living in this new way, but you really can't in the culture that you live in. You have your sense of yourself and what would be valuable that is sort of shifting. And all of that is actually a fairly significant challenge to a sense of stable identity. And then there's the response to the social issues, which is just nobody's talking about it, nobody's doing anything about it. And when you do bring it up, it tends to be an awkward conversation, even though 80% of people in the room are right there with you. So it's a sort of weird double bind that you're in. There are some names for these things. Solastalgia, I don't know if you guys have heard of this. Solastalgia is a word that's used for the sense of like, it's like nostalgia for the landscapes of the past. So, for example, if you're on Lake Mead in the summertime and you used to go there with your family and now it's all dried up and you all those happy memories, you have that sense of loss. Or if you grew up in Kentucky and you have these beautiful mountaintops and now they've been ruined by coal mining, that would be an example of solastalgia. It's sort of a mourning for the lost landscape. Eco-anxiety and ego distress actually don't have particularly great definitions. We've been trying to like just get a definition going on it. But we use that term, we use sort of eco-anxiety and eco-distress relatively interchangeably. And obviously the international words for those things are a little different. So for example, the German word has got like a lot more angst in it, and the Finnish word is a little different, and so forth. And then there's grief and rage. And then there's Cassandra syndrome, which is the sort of the Don't Look Up, the movie Don't Look Up, right? The despair that people feel when they've been calling this out for 3 decades and nobody's doing anything still at levels that we need them to. Again, helpful to remember that most of the planet is concerned in taking action. There's difficulties in terms of climate emotions with the sort of the complexity of the phenomenon itself, right? So people have talked about climate change being a hyperobject, being a wicked problem. It's complex, it's emergent. And these are all things that make it much more difficult to get psychologically around your response to it, right? You're sort of trying to come at an elephant from all different angles, and the elephant is changing and moving around as you're doing that. And it's operating in chaotic ways. And there's so many layers to the system that, one thing changes, you think it's going to be helpful, and then it turns out to be a problem, right? So, you get action recently happened in my world on stopping a geothermal plant that was going to go in right next to a town and ruin a dark skies area. And and then you're on to like the sage grouse, however, needs to be protected. And so we can't put any other kind of energy there because the sage grouse, so these kind of like complexities of working with it can be distressing for people. In psychiatry, we think about what is the model that we should use to think about this. And there are a number of different sort of psychological models. One of them is a notion of pre-traumatic stress disorder. So pre-traumatic stress disorder is the anticipation of stress. And actually in soldiers, soldiers who are highly traumatically worried about what's going to happen to them get higher rates of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so one model, you take the same scale for post-traumatic stress disorder, you put pre in front of all the items, is that climate anxiety is a form of pre-traumatic stress disorder, which then can give rise to post-traumatic stress disorder after, a major event or something. Another way of thinking about what's causing this distress is in terms of attachment theory. And there are various kinds of attachment that people have, secure attachment, disrupted attachment. And we can think of our problem with climate change as like a disrupted attachment disorder, which leads to distress and grief. We can see it as a kind of complicated bereavement in a couple of ways. Like complicated bereavement is you haven't moved on from the loss. We can think of ourselves as not moving on from the past values that we had, or we can think ourselves as unable to mourn what's happening successfully enough to move into a new way of living in a kind of way that is more like post-traumatic growth. And we can think of climate anxiety as being like a complex traumatic stress disorder. Complex traumatic stress disorder is it's like PTSD, but for people that have ongoing, continuous climate distress. So those are some of the theoretical models that people are thinking about climate distress with. And then there are the sort of ongoing questions that we have. Is it verified by research at all that this is a phenomenon? What kind of phenomenon? Should we be intervening professionally? What are the psychiatric comorbidities? If there is a psychiatric condition associated with it, what tips it over from being normal anxiety about a terrifying situation into something psychiatric? Are there certain worldviews that are sort of associated with having more climate distress? And the most important question, are the things that we're telling people might be helpful to do, are they actually doing anything? So those are the sort of research questions about it. So a few things that you can think about to do. If you're counseling a friend who has a lot of climate anxiety, the basics really are that you really want to validate the normalcy of whatever they're feeling. You do not want to tell them that they're crazy for being so distressed. The current scenarios are existentially terrifying. When somebody is not allowing themselves to care, comments that have to do with this really matters can be very grounding for people because it grounds them back in their values. And then, unlike a panic attack, where if you have a panic attack, you're really trying to let it just fade, right? And treat the symptoms as if they're just a symptom. In this particular case, you're really wanting to take action on the information that you have because you're anxious about something that is threatening. You should do something about it. And then both with yourself and with people that you know, try to sort of actively avoid collapsing emotionally. Some of the things that are helpful are various forms of attaching to nature, things like forest bathing and animal husbandry, and garden therapy, those kind of things. The work that reconnects is one group program that is particularly focused on securely attaching to the animal and more than human world. There are various ways of cultivating hope. Hope is generally thought of as something that you do. So in this post-election phase, we can't really be particularly hopeful, but we can act in ways that will make positive change and therefore cultivate the feeling of hope through the activity. Reasonable hope is kind of similar to that. And then there's this idea of radical hope, which is the idea of being hopeful when you cannot yet quite imagine where you're going, which is called radical hope, sort of modeled on spiritual traditions and indigenous traditions of using imaginary and spiritual and other kinds of evocative techniques to cultivate your awareness of potential futures. Optimism is kind of what it says. It's like remaining ironically optimistic. And there are various ways of staying in community when you do that. Climate cafes, the Good Grief Network, work that reconnects, and the forms of Jim Bendel, the deep adaptation forms, are things that we can talk about a little bit. A little bit deeper in terms of working with your eco-anxiety, you want to think about ways of containing your emotion. So what are the ways that you can contain your feelings of overwhelm? And there are many ways to do that. One is to have relational sort of strategies. You're with a friend, just a friend being there with you and saying, yes, it really sucks. Yes, it could be devastating. Even that sort of basic action can like put sort of normal, boring words on the terror that you're feeling, which can be a little bit regulating. Spiritual ways of regulating are very helpful. And then writing new stories, taking agency, and maybe designing new rituals. And there are several ways to sort of take all the emotion that you're feeling and transform yourself into living in a new way through a process of ritual similar to a coming of age ceremony or something. And then intellectual modes, as you guys are doing, like working, in your job, right? You have a lot of tasks that are cognitive tasks that keep you from becoming overwhelmed by emotion. There's also an idea of using dialectics to work with climate anxiety, which I'll talk about in a minute, because we tend to get stuck on one side or the other of extremes. And then the idea of deep reflection, right? So most growth in the face of trauma comes out of not ruminating excessively and negatively, but it does require rumination. And models of post-traumatic growth suggest that you need to spend a fair amount of time in quiet, deep reflection if you're really going to make truly meaningful change. And this is the idea of the dialectics. So in thinking about this, some of the things that we've thought about a little bit is that you often are sort of living more in line with one or the other version of something. So the climate reality would have you devote yourself entirely to what's happening with climate change and be entirely focused on that. But then you run up against the social reality of how people are and how slowly they change. And then that can create a lot of emotional disruption. Whereas if you flip yourself back and forth between one or the other, when you're overwhelmed by the climate reality, try to focus on, well, what are the social realities that impede are making progress on this. And when you're stuck in the social reality that nothing can change, think about what are the realities in the climate world that I need to be thinking about. Just by going back and forth between these things, you can actually open up a lot of creative space for like places that you might shift your views or become more active or engage more with different systems than you're engaged with now. Same thing with the sense of individual versus collective agency. People can get feeling that like, there's nothing I can do. I'll just recycle, or they can feel that I have to heroically do it all myself. And by flipping that, well, I can't, then I can focus on the collective. And when the collective is not action, can you flip back to individual agency? So just various ways that you can, between certainty and uncertainty, hope and hopelessness, nature is a threat, nature is comfort. When you find yourself on one side or the other of an extreme position in relationship to climate change, just flipping it to what would be the opposite can be super helpful. We've also used this idea of the metaphor of the baby. This is kind of a fancy name of just be right where you are with it. Everybody is coming to this in their own way, with their own experience, with their own ability to change. And if you shift your mental state to think about yourself like you're a baby who is just coming into awareness and can learn and change a tremendous amount, but does not have to bear the legacy of everything that preceded the moment that you're in right now, that can be helpful to put yourself in a state of innocence and get rid of the guilt and shame. It can be helpful to think about confusion as a positive thing, right? Similarly, a little bit further down on the slide, the idea of wait for it. When you find yourself deadened or confused or just kind of shut down and you don't want to do anything, just give it a little time, right? And, often out of the confusion or out of the sense of emotional exhaustion, your unconscious mind will make a joke or make a funny image or do something that actually can be a clue as to what you're missing and where you might need to think a little bit more in a way, or thinking a little bit more in a way that can be really super helpful and creative. And then the idea of writing new stories that we talked about already. I'm going to skip this slide. Um, this is the model that comes out of the deep adaptation forums, and they talk about the four R's of what can you relinquish, what can you retain, what can you resurrect, and what can you resist in processes of change. And this model starts with acceptance that collapse is inevitable. And so you're really talking about, like, in a situation of losing everything, how would you what would you keep, what would you lose, what would you try to recover, and these kind of things. Um, so let's see, I think we'll stop there actually. And let's see what you guys want to talk about.
Okay, and would I be able to address you as Dr. B? Is that what it looks like you'd prefer?
Beth is good.
Beth. Okay, Beth. So again, Sam McCloskey with the Missouri Department of Conservation. And one of the things I was thinking about while you were speaking was our recognition as an agency that in the management of fish, forest, and wildlife throughout the state of Missouri, connecting and engaging with those Missourians may have to start with an unorthodox topic like hunger, for instance, because an individual may not be able to have capacity for fish, forest, or wildlife without having first met that need. So with that in mind, I've got a couple questions for you that I'll work through, and then we have the ability to utilize questions from the group as a whole. So I'll work through some questions, and then we'll, if they show up in the chat or individuals raise their hands, we'll call on individuals as we get closer to that. Beth, how can someone balance staying informed about climate issues without overwhelming themselves?
Right. So, I mean, what do most people do, right? Hopefully, you're limiting yourself to no more than an hour of doom scrolling a day, right? That can be really, that's important, right? Your psyche just can't handle that much negativity. So you want to shut off your media at a certain point. Um, you want to have at least a few places in your social media feed that are focused on solutions or focused on positive things, right? So after you've been doing that for a little while, focusing on something negative, like look for something about something good that people are doing. I think having rituals in your daily life that reconnect you to nature can be really helpful with that. And for myself, there's actually not a formal answer to this question, but for myself, doing something small that preserves life every day, even if it only means that I saved an ant or watered a plant or like moved a spider outside or something like that, is really, really helpful. I don't know what other people do to keep themselves from overwhelm.
Well, and I think I've recognized as my bio states that just growing up in the outdoors and having access to it, I knew that there was an inherent benefit before I knew it. I just experienced that benefit.
Right. I mean, I think you guys may know some of the benefits of spending time in nature, right? It does so many good things for you, lowers your blood pressure, lowers your blood sugar, like does all these things, but it's also a good way to increase your attentional system so that you're not distracted by all the negative noise. So time in nature is certainly a really good thing. And then being in community. I mean, it really is important.
So, Beth, are there specific communities or populations that are more vulnerable to climate anxiety or those related stressors?
I don't know if there are specific populations other than children who are more vulnerable because we just don't have that much data about that actually. I mean, certainly are a lot of people that are much more vulnerable to psychic trauma because of climate change, right? So all of the socially disadvantaged groups are suffering far more in terms of their heat exposure, their air pollution exposure, the effect of those two things on their brain, their food deserts, their nutritional quality. All of that makes you much more vulnerable to climate related distress, just from a sociological perspective, right? In terms of kids, there's, sort of information about multiple traumas that would suggest that that is obviously difficult. So like in Northern California, where they've had several fires, over the last 10 years, fairly close by, some of them devastating. Those things are also associated with more substance abuse, domestic violence, poverty, the things that come after losing your home, right? And so by the time kids have been through two fires, they've actually accumulated at least 7 major life traumas. And that is a risk factor for later psychiatric distress. So I think thinking about, protective mechanisms for early trauma is really, really important, but also thinking about a model for how do people live with ongoing continuous trauma in a healthy way is really important. Again, no data. There's a group called the International Transformational Resilience Coalition that has been trying to, the ITRC, has been trying to get legislation through Congress to put in community-wide resilience training. So like everybody in the community will get trained in grounding skills and in presencing skills, things like mindfulness. Whether that actually is going to make a difference when your house burns down for the second time is really actually anybody's game. I mean, it may not. And so far, the evidence from previous things like after 9/11, after Hurricane Katrina, there were resilience training programs. And the data is honestly fairly equivocal about whether they were protective in any way. But just I think being aware that that's kind of a lot of the focus of what we're talking about is the cumulative trauma burden. So, yeah.
So, Beth, you hit on this at least to an extent. I think maybe on the more long term mental health effects. But what does this anxiety do maybe to a person's day to day life, and how would that be visible?
Formal answer, I don't really know. Anecdotally, there is some increase in suicidality in young people with climate distress. Um, like I said, it can show up in acting out kinds of behaviors. It can show up in some depressive withdrawal, kind of quitting, demoralization syndromes. Um, it can show up in a lot of obsessive compulsive kinds of symptoms. People are sort of obsessively checking whether they've done everything right. It can show up in over preoccupation with the media, over dedication, and sort of zealousness. And that can be deleterious for your relationships. So getting over involved and then losing the supportive relationships that you have, that can be an issue.
Beth, you mentioned reducing the amount of time that you doom scroll, for instance, or you're engaged in that social media type conversation. Are there other healthy ways that you can identify managing climate anxiety without ignoring or downplaying those environmental issues?
I think opening your mouth is a really good one, because there is a feeling of being suppressed. And, I think it's about 70-80% of people are running around holding on to all this distress, and only 30% of them have ever had a conversation with anybody about it. So getting over the discomfort about talking about it so that it becomes normalized, I think is a really important, particularly for the people that are here today, right? I am doing this because I am concerned about climate change. And I think that you will find that your food supply is dwindling because of this information about what's happening locally with blah, 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 feels incredibly awkward. And so just getting good at that conversation makes you less anxious about what you're holding on to, right? And allows other people to carry the burden of the information a little bit more. So I do think that that's important, right? Is to share that it's what you're anxious about. The other things that we've talked about: community, nature, exercise, mindfulness, and then some just techniques for seeing if your perspective is being distorted, and then attaching yourself to something that is larger than yourself. There can be a kind of psychic fatalism, right, where people can go, "Oh, well, I'm just part of the larger cycles of life, that's all there is." But it is truly helpful to understand that you are part of larger cycles of culture and history, and you can only do what you can do, right? And that can actually be super focusing, because you're like, well, I can't do anything about all that, but I can do what's right in front of me right now, you know. Other cultures, American cultures, the American culture is like not actually great for climate anxiety, because we're we're like highly built on like heroism, individualism, all these kinds of values of like capitalism. And so if you're sort of working with all those values, it's pretty hard to actually be effective in terms of climate. So sort of working with more sort of older cultures' values of, spiritual connection to the land, interdependency of people and nature, larger cycles of intergenerational cycles rather than every person has to be a superstar. Those kind of non-American values can be things to sort of cultivate in yourself, or at least be aware when you're taking resort to your sense of being, needing to hold on to that traditionalism. And it can also be helpful to talking with other people about it, like, because I think a lot of the reason that we are having such trouble as America in moving forward is because we do cling to this old way of living because it's part of our identity, right? And under threat, we tend to cling to our identity. So, yeah.
Again, you mentioned social media, but I'll also caveat or add on news outlets in this question. That sometimes those can amplify that conversation, maybe in a negative way or potentially in a positive way. What roles do those play in that amplification or alleviation of climate anxiety?
Yeah, I don't think I have a ton to say about that particular question actually, but I mean, certainly we know a lot about the ways that the media is seeking to pull on emotions, right? And for example, with incoming hurricanes, the attempt to get us all worked up about how big the hurricane is going to be is a pretty good example of that, right? And so just having skills for disinformation, misinformation, evaluation, having skills for noticing when you feel like your gut is kind of drawn into something is something that I think that we have really not paid very much attention to in psychiatry, and really need to. So we tried to do an action paper on misinformation, disinformation as as an important thing for psychiatrists to be engaged in, right? We spend a lot of time treating psychotic people, right? It's one of our big jobs. And so evaluating whether something is real or not real is like something you get trained to do as a psychiatrist. But we haven't really translated that yet into misinformation, disinformation, psychosis. Like, how do we train people on these other kinds of reality evaluation, right? And so I think there's a huge room for somebody to come in and do some interesting work on that. And I think there's huge room for someone to come in and take work on cognitive biases and develop psychological skills for people to check their own cognitive biases. Like, I think if there were like real shortcuts for people in terms of, am I doing some judgmental discounting? Am I doing some, whatever the bias is? If we could put that into psychotherapy and also put that into like useful checks that people could say, is my judgment, what is influencing my judgment about this? That could be super useful for people. But it's not there yet. Yeah.
From the perspective of an individual who may be experiencing climate anxiety, what do you imagine are some of the barriers to receiving this help or learning about the possibilities that you've discussed? What barriers might those individuals face, and how would you overcome those or assist them in overcoming those?
Yeah. But like I said, the 2017 was a big year for climate anxiety. All of the big media outlets were like, eco anxiety, it's a big thing. Prior to that, it kind of didn't exist actually. Like the first person who ever wrote something about mental illness and climate change was in 2009, right? And then up until 2014, there really was not much more than that one monograph. And it wasn't until 2016 that we even had a group of people like working on it in psychiatry, 2014, 15 for psychologists. So all of this stuff is really new. And um, so we just don't have very good answers for that question yet. However, um, there are a great number of people that are highly concerned about it and working on it. And there is a program which is mostly run by the Climate Psychology Alliance, called the Climate Aware Therapy Program. And we started with having people sign a pledge that they were a climate aware therapist. And what that meant was that they were going to recognize the realities of climate change in terms of how they might impinge on their patients' lives, right? They weren't going to pretend that it was really about their mother that they felt so frightened about growing up. And now we have a climate aware therapy training program where people get sort of up to speed on, really understanding at least the basics of climate change, about why it's so complicated psychologically to deal with, this kind of stuff, and then maybe some techniques for helping people with it. Yeah.
Great. So Beth, we have a question from somebody in the group. This is from Rachel. You spoke about how we should share how we are feeling with others as a way to cope. How do you have a structured conversation about climate change without it becoming just complaining about the problems?
Rachel, what do you think? What have you tried that has worked?
Yeah. So in the past, I've talked with friends and family about this topic, and it tends to bring to mind all the problems about climate change and all the things that I'm scared or nervous about. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on how to help cope with it. I haven't come across something that has really worked for me super great. So I find myself just avoiding the conversations altogether. And it sounds like that's not the best way to go about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a difficult thing. I think noticing the process and maybe verbalizing the process can be helpful. Um, so whether you're talking about yourself or whether you're talking about the process that's happening in the group, right? Um, just commenting that I notice that when I'm doing this, I am starting to feel dead inside, or I'm really just becoming flooded by negativity. Is anybody else having that experience? Right? Anybody have a suggestion for breaking the ice on that? Probably it would be helpful to, we always try to end with like a bright moment or a helpful moment, like some sort of solution or beautiful moment of beauty or something like that.
Okay. I
I
think that's
think
helpful.
also, like, just one more thought, which is that this is kind of what I was talking about before when I talked about the dialectics, right? When you get into that position where you're emotionally stuck for some reason, right? Flipping to the opposite, right, is helpful at that moment, not only to you, but it's helpful to the rest of the group, right? And so if you're feeling really, really negative, right, or really, really hopeless, if we were to focus on the things that are hopeful at that time, how would we change what we're doing? And I think, like, for example, just in the past week with the election, um, people were well on their way to becoming super stuck in hopelessness, right? And just beginning to think about what are the reasons to be hopeful within, the things that we can do within the resilience of people who are environmentally concerned to continue to pursue lawsuits and continue to protect what they can, you know, just to kind of try to flip to the opposite is helpful, and to notice when you are yourself being impinged on by your own guilt and shame that you're not doing enough, you're not good enough. Right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Daniel or Evan, are you seeing any other questions in the chat or any hands raised that I've missed?
Not, no, not that I have seen. If anybody does have any additional questions, we very much invite you to either put something in the chat or turn off turn off mute and go ahead and ask it. We have about 8 or so more minutes that we have dedicated time. So now's your time if you have any specific questions or things on your mind that you'd like to discuss.
And I would love to kick the conversation back to you guys. What are you struggling with in terms of climate related distress? What kinds of feelings and what are you doing about it? Um, I'm really interested in what your solutions have been.
I can speak a little bit just about myself. I know that personally, just being in green spaces and really making it a point to spend good time in green spaces does make me feel a bit more like connected to the earth, literally, and knowing that obviously this sort of large scale thing is happening, and sort of like you said, there's this you can feel helpless and that I can't solve it. Seeing in my local parks the seasonal changes year over year is to me a friendly reminder that although this is an issue and we shouldn't ignore it, the sky is not necessarily falling right now, and we can still enjoy.
Those are great, yeah. What about other people?
Okay, in the chat, Sherry mentions, I agree with Daniel that green spaces do help. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and conversation.
Yeah, and I think from my personal perspective, it really the things that I deal with, whether it's related to climate or anything else, is just over being overwhelmed and having access to it's just information overload. If you have a topic that's on your mind that's either causing you distress or someone mentioned to you in passing, I mean, that can just kind of send you down a rabbit hole that really is never ending. So I know you mentioned at the beginning of this, keeping yourself to an hour of doom scrolling can be really hard to do when we have access just to essentially limitless information. You know, it's it kind of after a while just gives you a sense of numbness because what specific issues do you focus on? Where is your attention best put? All this stuff can just be quite overwhelming. Just to know how to dedicate your a relatively limited you know brain brain space that we have for these things. It's just easy to get overwhelmed um, and yeah, find yourself numb or prone to inaction.
Do people do meditation, grounding? Do you know what kinds of grounding are available to you? Um,
Comes comes for myself personally. Those type of exercises kind of come and go. I'll go a couple months where I have a nice meditation practice, and then for whatever reason it falls off. So that consistency is always what I struggle with. As much as I am aware of the positive impacts it's having on me, it can sometimes be hard to keep up with the practice.
3 minutes.
Hmm.
And if you don't have time for it, just take one of your senses and do something that roots you in one of your senses.
Mm.
You can always close your eyes and pay attention to what's happening on your eyelashes, right? And you can also just take off your shoes and stand on the ground, put your hands down. Some pretty good data on earthing and grounding. And if you have a little bit of aromatherapy around, that could be helpful. But it doesn't have to be 20 minutes of perfect meditation, but even just that few minutes, just what I do for myself is I just say, like, what would be good to do now, right? And also try to accept my own imperfection. I might just not have the energy for it.
With the holiday season coming up, I had a friend recently point out to me that a lot of reasons we do things like bring colorful lights and bring trees indoors in winter is sort of rooted in this idea that winter means, that this sort of the brightness and vibrancy of nature disappears, and that it's good for our mental health, our spiritual health as well, to sort of recreate uh, the vibrancy of outdoor spaces in, the sunnier seasons in the winter. And I was just really, really fascinated by that. This idea that this thing that we see is so rooted in holiday is also sort of grounded in this idea of just maintaining our connection to greenery and green spaces in the season where the trees die, where the trees go down.
Bad for evergreens, right? Yeah. Anybody else? We have a couple more minutes. I'm really curious. Jim, you've been smiling away there. We can't hear you if you're speaking, but Chris is coming on also. Chris, any thoughts?
I'll go ahead and say something. I just put in the chat, I had to be late. I'm running between birthdays and work and this and that. But I'm really glad that IRC is doing this series. And I really wanted to, I knew I wasn't going to be able to make the full thing, but I am going to watch the recording and take what your recommendations were because it's really needed. And, different strokes for different boat. Sometimes what you were just saying about breaking things down into smaller things. If you can't do a 20-minute, do a 2 or a 5, and not to do that all the time. I think that's important, is not to get in the habit of thinking that you can shorten everything and it will be as effective. But, sometimes you have to.
You cannot do anything until you're feeling safe, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to function. So you got to accept that physiological reality and create that for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So I very much appreciate that you shared your wisdom today. And I will be watching the recording and I'll be able to respond. I'll be talking to the air, but hey, that works.
All right. Anybody else got like one last thought of something you've tried or something that you've read about trying or?
Okay. I'll throw out there. I started a garden a couple of years ago, and the food is great. Like, having some success with it is great. But what really initially drew me to it is just seeing things grow, like plants grow day over day. Like, it doesn't matter what's happening with the world, like they grow.
Mm-hmm.
And that consistency kind of made me a little bit more level in some of my fears. But yeah, I don't think don't think that it is a fix for everything, especially with the election that just happened. But it's a good grounding activity for me.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, so Daniel just put in the chat the resilient activist, and then just to reinforce the other groups that are available, deep adaptation forums, the work that reconnects, Good Grief Network, climate cafes, and then Climate Psychology Alliance, Climate Psychiatry Alliance. Happy to connect you to resources. There's tons of resources on our website.
Well, Beth, Sam, thank you so much for your time and energy today. Thank you everyone who joined the conversation. It means a lot that you took some time out of your day to engage with this topic. Again, we were recording it, so if you know anybody in your network who might value the information that was presented today, we invite you to share the link with them. That should be made available to you tomorrow. And we do hope that you will consider, if you're in the Kansas City area, joining us on December 4th for our final program in the series. Again, that's going to be at the Evergy campus. It's going to be at noon on December 4th. That's a Wednesday. We hope to see you there. You can register on our website, irckc.org. And again, thank you so much. And we hope to see you on a program again soon.
Thank you. I admire you guys' work so much. You're doing amazing stuff.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good day, everyone.